In 1998, he received an MA in Indigenous Studies from Trent University and completed the thesis, Anumiani, the Prayer People and Pagans of Walpole Island First Nation. In 2011, he received a PhD in history from the University of Regina for the dissertation, Mediating the Numbered Treaties, Eyewitness Accounts of the Numbered Treaties between the Crown and Indigenous Peoples, 1871 to 1876. This research became the basis for No Surrender, The Land Remains Indigenous, which was published by the University of Regina Press in 2019 and includes a foreword by Dr. Winona Wheeler. Dr. Krasinowski has taught both history and Indigenous Studies departments at the First Nations University of Canada, Vancouver Island University, the University of Saskatchewan, Blue Quills First Nations College, the University of Calgary, and Athabasca University. He has completed research for the Assembly of the Manitoba Chiefs, the Métis Nation of Ontario, and is currently a co-investigator on a research project with the Montreal Lake Cree Nation on the Treaty 6 adhesion of 1889. Sheldon began his research journey with the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in 1998, and after a hiatus of almost 20 years, is currently the Director of Research and Archives at the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatoon. Welcome, Dr. Krasinowski.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. And thank you to Carla. And thanks also to Elizabeth Scott for thinking of me when you guys were doing your coffee clubs. It's always fun to talk treaty, fun to talk about my research, which was described in great detail in the introduction, which was always fun to listen to. Yeah, this is a presentation on my research regarding the numbered treaties, and yeah, my name's Sheldon. I grew up in Saskatoon, went to Holy Cross High School, went to the University of Saskatchewan, kind of bounced around in different majors. At that time, in the early 90s, Indigenous Studies was very new. I was one of the first cohorts of graduates, and back then it was about 50-50 Indigenous, non-Indigenous. I think it's probably similar, maybe in terms of who the majors are in Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And I actually had to drive up from Prince Albert this morning. I teach one class at the U of S in Indigenous Studies up at the PA campus. So that's fun for me in my old age to teach a class each term and hang out with the young students. So it's great to see the students. And it's kind of funny, when I was first teaching as a sessional lecturer, Indigenous Studies classes were very few and far between. And then coming back to Saskatchewan from Alberta, and all of the interest in Indigenous history has created a huge growth in both interest and the number of courses offered at the US in Indigenous Studies. So it's actually a little bit easier to get a couple classes to teach every year, which is fun. So I'll get into my research, and if people have questions, I'll definitely leave time at the end. But if you have questions during the talk, you can absolutely ask them. That's fine. I get a bit drony and I get a bit quick when I'm talking. So if I'm going too fast, or if you guys have a question, please let me know. I'm happy to slow down and answer a question or discuss a comment. Maybe if I don't see the hand on the screen, or if I miss it, Carla can let me know and we can take a question as I go through. So as Carla mentioned, I am the Director of Research for the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. The current Treaty Commissioner is Mary Culberson. She's from Kiskous First Nation, and she kind of rescued me from academia in Alberta and offered me the position to come back and create an archives for the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. And I had been there in the late 90s, and I really wanted to come back to Saskatchewan from Calgary, so I jumped at the opportunity and have been there since January of 2020. This is our archives, which we just started. As you can see in the photo, there's actually still boxes, so we're still unpacking it, but it's slowly coming together. And so in terms of my research, so my PhD dissertation was in treaty making in the history of treaties. And of course, part of what you do in your research is you have to choose a thesis statement and you have to do a literature review. And so the first thing I did is I said, well, what were other historians writing about treaties? And so this slide just kind of shows a bunch of different books, but the books on my left, The Birth of Western Canada, Jill St. Germain's Broken Treaties, and Jean-Pierre Morin's Solemn Words. These are very well-known books on history that emphasize a more conservative interpretation of treaties. And this is kind of the common interpretation that we know of today, which is that during the treaty negotiations, the Indigenous leadership and the treaty commissioners, the Crown, had such different perspectives that neither really understood the goals or the implications of making a treaty, and common misunderstandings occurred. And these common misunderstandings impeded the treaty. The treaty was concluded, but these lingering misunderstandings had a negative impact. And then the books on the right, the first one I'll mention is The True Spirit and Original Intent of Treaty 7 by the Treaty 7 Elders and Tribal Council. You can't see the authors, but it's Sarah Carter, Walter Hildebrandt, and Dorothy Firstrider from Treaty 7, also Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty by Amy Craft, Being Here to Stay by Michael Ash, and then my publication is No Surrender, which Carla had mentioned. And then these are books that are a little bit newer, and all of these books, especially Michael Ash, argue against that the Crown and First Nations had a long relationship prior to treaty through the fur trade, through the Hudson's Bay Company, through early settlement, through explorers, and that the Crown did know what the goals of the First Nations leadership was, and First Nations leadership also had an idea of what to look forward to in the treaty relationship, but that the Crown misled the First Nations leadership, specifically over land and specifically over the surrender clause. And so that kind of that's kind of the really short literature review, and that kind of sets the context of what my research was in. It was basically arguing against this idea of common misunderstandings and looking really closely at the treaty relationship and looking specifically at land. So in my research, the first thing that I did is I looked at Indigenous oral history. And when I was doing my PhD, I was lucky because prior to, maybe even 5 or 10 years before that, I did my PhD. I did my BA and my MA in Indigenous Studies programs. But at the time, there were no PhDs in Indigenous Studies. So I had to do my PhD in history at the University of Regina. But at that point, oral history was being more welcome within the discipline of history. 5 or 10 years earlier, and there was a serious bias against oral history. And the chair of my dissertation committee, I was really lucky to get Dr. Winona Wheeler to chair my committee, even though she was at the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina was the university that I did my degree in. There are very few people that are knowledgeable of treaties. And of those, there are very few people that have that background in oral history, but Dr. Wheeler is one of them. So her first piece of advice after I did my literature review and did my year of coursework, she said, okay, Sheldon, now go into the research phase, but before you choose a thesis and before you read any of the secondary literature on treaties, any of the articles or any of the archival research, the primary research on treaty history, look at the oral history first, was what she said. So I spent my first year, she basically said, spend your first year looking at nothing but Indigenous oral histories of treaty making. And at first I was kind of like, I think I'm grown up enough, and I think I have enough research experience that I can balance looking at both the historical record and the oral history of treaties. But Dr. Wheeler was my chair, and if you learn anything going through a couple different degrees at universities is you always listen to your committee, you always listen to your chair. So I took her advice. I didn't look at any archival research. I looked at only oral history. So I looked at Cree, Soto, which you guys mentioned in your great land acknowledgement for Treaty 4. I looked at Blackfoot, Nistasapi for Treaty 7. I looked up north some of the Dene. I did include Treaty 8 in my original research, even though it's not included in the book. So I looked at all these different oral histories of treaty, and there was one common theme that came through in all this oral history, and it's this idea that the numbered treaties, treaties 1 through 7 or 1 through 8, are not land surrender treaties, they're land sharing treaties. This is what really came through in all the oral history that I was listening to. And I was really lucky because I started this research when I was back with the Office of the Treaty Commission in the late 90s, and I had access to 3 really great elders. I had access to Elder Danny Musqua from Kisakus. I had access to the late Elder Gordon Oakes from Nekani, and I had access to the late Elder Jimmy Mayo from Moosomin First Nation. So these elders were always around the office, and they were really great about sharing their knowledge, about sharing their treaty teachings. Outside of that, it was mostly, at that time, it was mostly audio recordings. So a lot of audio recordings of interviews with elders, a lot of transcripts of interviews. And I'm not a Cree speaker. I don't know Indigenous languages. I'm non-Indigenous from Saskatoon. And so that was a liability. But luckily for me, a lot of the interviews had been translated. And so I was able to take advantage of that and take advantage of really looking at this huge breadth of oral history. And like I say, that common theme is that there was no land surrender during the treaty negotiations. Treaties were meant to be land sharing agreements. And so after completing that year of the oral history research, then I shifted into the archival research, and then I had my thesis statement. My thesis statement was basically what the elders had said. It wasn't mine. I basically copied it from the elders, but I wanted to take that idea from oral history and see if it could be proven, see if it could be reinforced through the archival record. So I spent the next, well, it took me longer than 5 years to do my dissertation. I think in the end, it took 7 years. I got 2 one-year extensions. So I spent quite a bit of time in the archives, and I looked at, and the other thing that I kind of talk about in my research is this idea of what is a treaty. And so I really tried to expand the idea of what is a treaty. So like I was telling my students yesterday, for treaty, most people look at the treaty text. Like you can Google the treaty text, you can look at the text of Treaty 4 or the text of Treaty 6, but that's only one part of the treaty. I also, for the treaty for me is also the oral history, which I mentioned. And then for me, it's really the supporting documents that surround the verbal negotiations. And that's kind of what I focused on when I was in the archives. I tried to find as many written records that reflected what happened during the actual verbal negotiations. And so that was what my archival research focused on, these eyewitness accounts. And then the fourth part of treaties, just to get it out there, is the solemnity, the spirituality of treaties, which I know very little about. And it didn't really enter that much into my research. I mostly focused on the eyewitness accounts. We'll talk a little bit about spirit and intent of treaty a little bit later in the talk. But for the verbal negotiations, I looked at Northwest Mounted Police records. I looked at journalist accounts. I looked at the public records, the treaty commissioners' accounts, treaty commissioner dispatches, but I also looked at the private letters of treaty commissioners. I looked at records from government documents, from Department of Indian Affairs. I looked at missionary accounts. Missionary accounts were very valuable. So I looked at all these different records to try to paint a picture of what actually happened during the verbal negotiations. And so that's basically what this slide shows. And the image here is kind of emphasizes the importance of oral history and the importance of a larger context for treaties. People don't really know much about the Selkirk Treaty because Treaty 1 replaced it in 1871. But this is basically, this map shows where Winnipeg is today. This is the conflicts of the Red and Assiniboine rivers. And the Selkirk Treaty was negotiated in 1817. And it eventually is replaced by Treaty 1, but it's a really interesting treaty because I don't know if you can see on your screens, but there's 3 little circles, and then there's dots along the rivers. And for the Selkirk Treaty, the reserves were actually for settlers in the negotiations of the Selkirk Treaty. And one of the chiefs of the Selkirk Treaty was Chief Pegwas, who's really well known. He was one of the negotiators. And so the Selkirk Treaty is really interesting. And when I studied Treaty 1, I also wanted to bring that idea of the Selkirk Treaty. And even in 1871, a lot of the chiefs negotiating said, Henry Prince, who is Pegwas's descendant, said, well, the treaty that was made previously, he mentioned that the reserves were for settlers. Why now is it different? Why now are you changing that idea of land? So it was kind of an interesting piece, and that's why I have that image. You can also see the animals, the sturgeon and the caribou and the fox. That's how the chiefs signed the treaty. Prior to the number treaties, all of the earlier treaties have totem signatures on them, which I'll come to a little bit later as well. So these are the eyewitness accounts that I was discussing. Most of what I looked at was at Library and Archives Canada. I also looked at the Glenbow, Alberta Archives, Provincial Archives of Alberta, of course, Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan. Luckily, when I was doing my research, they still had an office in Saskatoon. Fur traders account, police I mentioned, missionaries I mentioned, and of course, translators. Translation of the treaty terms is one of the most controversial parts of the number treaties. And for Treaty 6, the interpreter was Peter Erasmus, who was Métis, and he actually left an account, which was published after his death, of the Treaty 6 negotiations. So there's quite a few accounts of what actually took place during the treaty negotiations. So this is kind of a more general overall. This is a map that I put together, which you can probably, those that know maps, know that this is probably not the best looking map. But what I was trying to show is that there's more to the negotiation of treaties than just the treaty sites themselves. So I tried to include some extra information in this map. So for example, at the bottom corner where it says Fort Frances, one of the stereotypes of treaties is that the government of Canada brought the treaty to the Indigenous leadership, and there was no real negotiation. The chiefs basically just had to accept whatever Canada was prepared to offer. And this is a very common stereotype about treaties. But what's interesting about Treaty 3, where you see Fort Frances, it says the Treaty 3 negotiations failed in 1870, 71, and 72. So right away, in my literature review, I looked at all the historical records of people that were arguing that. And I was like, well, if that's the case, why did it take 4 years to successfully negotiate Treaty 3? Treaty 3 is not negotiated until 1873, but Canada tries. In 1869, they negotiated right of way, not a full treaty. And then 1870, they fail. 1871, the negotiations failed. In 1872, they failed. The chiefs just would not accept Canada's terms. They were not willing to enter into treaty until finally in 1873, they're successful. So the first treaty was supposed to be at Fort Frances, but it ends up being Treaty 1, where Winnipeg is today, 1871. It's negotiated at Lower Fort Garry, which you can see. Treaty 2 followed right on the heels of Treaty 1, also negotiated in 1871. Treaty 3, as I mentioned, is 1873. Then we go back to where Moose Jaw, where most of you are today. Treaty 4 was negotiated. Actually, none of these were negotiated at the forts. They're all negotiated near the forts. So near Fort Qu'Appelle, Treaty 5 is northern Manitoba. You can see at Barons River and Norway House. And then finally, Treaty 6, you have the negotiations near Fort Carleton, near Fort Pitt, and also there were negotiations with Chief Beardy, kind of halfway between where Beardy's and Okamesa's First Nation is and where Fort Carleton is now. So it kind of gives a little bit larger context to the negotiation of the number treaties. So with that idea of context again, one of the things that is important to consider is that from the perspective of the treaty commissioners, and the main treaty commissioner for the number treaties was a man named Alexander Morris. He was the second lieutenant governor of Manitoba. He negotiated treaties 3, 4, 5, and 6. And for the treaty commissioners and the assistant treaty commissioners and the representative of the Crown, there was a lot of pressure on them to negotiate treaty. So under John A. Macdonald's national policy, national plan, he had promised a rail line to British Columbia. At the time, there was also the Northwest uneasiness. Right before Treaty 6, 1873, 1874, 1875, in that time period, settlers were just starting to come out into the plains. And they were met with resistance from First Nations because First Nations did not want to have any settlement prior to the negotiation of treaty. In fact, the Canada attempts to send people to construct the telegraph line and also surveyors to start mapping surveyors. And it was Chief Sweetgrass's son kind of found them and found all their wagon loads of goods and all their supplies and asked them what they were doing in Cree territory. And according to the story, they could not answer to the sufficiency of the chief's son. And so he pointed their wagon train east and said, "You must return." And they went back to Winnipeg. And that kind of started the negotiation of treaties. And also what I mentioned, the unsuccessful negotiations of Treaty 3. So those failures in 1871, 1870, 70 and 72 really put pressure on the treaty commissioners for a successful treaty negotiation. And part of that pressure was an early treaty commissioner by the name of Simon James Dawson had recommended that the chiefs would require an annuity of $10 per person in order to negotiate treaty. And this is the this little image here is a Privy Council letter, and it kind of just emphasizes the idea of the enormous pressure. So initially, the Office of the Privy Council accepted Simon James Dawson's recommendation, and you can see in this letter it says arrangements in their power, but authorized if need be to give as much as $12, and then it's supposed to be a head, and you can see head is crossed out, partly in goods and partly in money, for the surrender of lands described in the earlier part of this report. So this is the Privy Council document authorizing treaty, and initially they offered as much as $12 per person as an annuity payment. And those of you that know a little bit about treaty know that the annuity was actually ended up being set as $5. And you can kind of see where a head is crossed out, and instead it's $12 per family for each family not exceeding 5, with a small sum addition where the family exceeds 5, as the commissioner may find necessary. So that just kind of shows the immense pressure. $12 a head was a lot of money back in the 1870s, but because of that pressure, initially the Office of the Privy Council accepted Simon James Dawson's recommendation, and then of course crossed it out at the last minute. So this is this idea of common misunderstandings. So when we talk about the verbal negotiations of treaty, because the commissioners were under such immense pressure, and the First Nations leadership was also under immense pressure at the same time, and this is mainly because of overhunting of bison. So by the 1860s, 1870s, early 1870s, the First Nations leadership is realizing that the bison are really diminishing, and that was so much a part of the economy. And so First Nations, while there was immense pressure on the Crown to allow settlement in the West, there was also immense pressure on the First Nations leadership because of the demise of the bison, because of the extermination of the bison or the overhunting of the bison. And so when the two groups came together, both sides had immense pressure. And one of the things that happened right away is that everything got thrown on the table. And I'm going back to Treaty 1 for this example. During the Treaty 1 negotiations, the Treaty Commissioner was Adams G. Archibald, and the first thing that he proposed is this idea of reserves. And so I think it was 2 or 3 days of negotiations just talking about land. And then finally, with the chiefs describing where their traditional territories were and what land they wanted set aside, finally Archibald said, well, if this is what you are prepared to, he used the term share or allow use of, then that doesn't leave any land for settlers, is basically what he said. And so at that point, the treaty commissioners kind of get together, and in my book, I argue that they came up with a strategic plan, which was to never mention land again because it was so controversial at the time. And so after that point, neither Archibald nor Morris that follows him ever mentioned land during the negotiation of the number treaties. Their strategy, which they discussed in a lot of letters between the Department of Indian Affairs, was to discuss only the benefits of treaty and none of the liabilities. So I wasn't the first person to recognize this in the verbal negotiations. So when I was looking at all these records of the negotiations, looking at all the different speeches, looking at all the different records, another historian had written about Treaty 6 and realized that in none of the historical record was land mentioned or was the surrender clause mentioned. And so what I did is I just applied that to the remaining numbered treaties, and I looked at the verbal negotiations to see if it was the case for Treaty 1, if it was the case for Treaty 3 and 4. And from what I was able to find out in the archival record, it was the case. In none of the verbal negotiations for any of the numbered treaties do the commissioners mention land or mention the surrender clause. And that's one of the arguments in the Treaty 7 book by Dorothy Firstrider and Sarah Carter, is that how can First Nations be expected to understand that they surrendered their land when a land surrender was not discussed in the verbal negotiations? And for those of you that know about the treaty text, you'll know that each treaty text does have a surrender clause. We do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the Crown all of our rights, titles, privileges whatsoever. So it's very prominent in the text of treaty, but it's completely absent from the verbal negotiations. And so when I was doing my research, I found that highly problematic in terms of this reconciliation for what was in the treaty text and then what was actually discussed in the verbal negotiations. And this image on the screen, when I was doing my research, there were always lots of rumors when you talk to people about alternate treaties, like different versions of treaties. Some people say, my First Nations people would say, oh, I know someone's cousin's uncle's grandfather has like the true Treaty 4 in their closet, and it shows exactly what happened in the negotiations. And so I was always looking for these mysterious documents, and for the most part, they don't exist. This is the closest that we get. This is known as the PAPOM document. And the Treaty 3 chiefs actually hired a man named Charles Nolan, who was Métis. These are also known as Nolan's Notes. And it's an account of Treaty 3. Basically, Charles Nolan was hired to record the terms of treaty that were discussed in the Treaty 3 negotiations. And the interesting thing about Nolan's notes, which you can see here, they almost line up identically with the terms of treaty in the treaty text. But one thing that, of course, is absent in Nolan's notes is there's no mention of a surrender clause. And there's one addition to Nolan's notes that's not in the text of treaty, which is that in addition to providing agricultural supplies to support First Nations with the demise of the bison, that they would also protect the wild rice harvest. So this is the one alternate treaty that I was able to find out, which is basically Nolan's notes of the Treaty 3 negotiations. And the photo is from First Nations University. This is the typed copy on parchment of Treaty 8. And the interesting thing about this Treaty 8 parchment is that it has a carrying tube, and that's because of the importance of hunting, fishing, and trapping in the North. Right after Treaty 8 was concluded in 1899, the Crown started putting limitations on hunting in that territory. And so the chiefs requested the treaty on hide that they could carry with them. So if police or conservation officers tried to limit their hunting, they would have this treaty. So chiefs would actually carry this treaty around to try to protect themselves after the negotiation of Treaty 8. This is available at the First Nations University of Canada Library in Regina. So this is what I was talking about, Canada's strategic plan. As I mentioned, it originated in the Treaty 1 negotiations. The treaty commissioners basically decided that they would discuss only the benefits of treaty. They would not mention land. They would not mention the surrender clause. And that was confirmed in both my research and the research of other people, as I mentioned in that opening slide of the literature review. They also distanced the First Nations leadership from the treaty text. And so I showed the Selkirk Treaty and the totem signatures. And interestingly, for the number treaties, Treaty 1 and later, those totem signatures stop. Instead, the First Nations leadership shook the hand of the clerk, or shook the hand of the treaty commissioner and touched the pen of the clerk, rather than draw their totem signatures. So up until about 1864, it's all totem signatures. And then at Treaty 1 in 1871, that changes. And it was a strategy that they actually got from the United States, where treaty commissioners in the US would use it as a way to distance leadership from the treaty text. So rather than actual signing the document, it would be the handshake, it would be touching the pen, and it's the clerk that made the X's. All the X's are the same on the original manuscripts. And then finally, the strategic plan also reflected how the treaty was interpreted. So this is the most controversial and the most difficult part to explain. Under the rules of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, one of the rules for a successful treaty is that the treaty text must be read at the close of the negotiations. But I found the reading of the treaty text to be highly, highly, highly problematic. For example, for Treaty 3, the interpreter who read the treaty text, there were 3 interpreters, one of which was James McKay, who was also a treaty commissioner for the Crown, very much pro-Canada. He's the one who interprets Treaty 3. Charles Pratt for Treaty 4 is really interesting, where Moose Jaw is. He was First Nations from Gordon's, but in the newspaper account of the Treaty 4 negotiations, it's revealed that Charles Pratt was not told that he would have to interpret the text of treaty at the close of the negotiations. He was just handed over 11 pages of legal text and said, here you go, interpret this. And so if you ever want to do a thought experiment, even just reading it takes a long time and you start to kind of fade, but in order to interpret it, it would be very difficult. So Canada also was very careful about who they had interpret the treaty text at the close of the negotiations. Oh, and this is an interesting little piece regarding annuities again. This is from Hudson's Bay Company. This is a letter to from Richard Hardesty to William Joseph Christie, talking about the close relationship between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Crown. And here it says, one man had 6 wives and 20 children at Capel, and I paid him $277. You can imagine this is a lot of money in 1874. And this is what was promised under treaty: $25 per chief, $15 per soldier or headman, and $5 per person for every man, woman, and child, plus ammunition and twine. And so they're basically just talking about how the Hudson's Bay Company got the contract for that. But it's really interesting how the role that annuities play in terms of livelihood, something to think about. So in terms of my own research, I think this is my last slide. So in terms of my own research, like I said, I looked at the oral history, and the main theme in the oral history was that the number treaties are land sharing treaties, not land surrender treaties. But in the archival research, I really I didn't have direct evidence. I had an absence of evidence. I basically showed that there was no discussion of the surrender clause during the treaty negotiations. And I really wanted a smoking gun. I wanted something to say, okay, well, here's a record where they're instructing the treaty commissioners to not mention the surrender clause, to purposefully mislead the chiefs. I never found that. This is the closest that I got to it. This is an account of the Treaty 3 negotiations, and it's 2 different records of the actual Treaty 3 negotiations. The one on my left, the typed one, is the official account of the Treaty 3 negotiations. It was published in a number of different books, Commissioner's Dispatch, and it's the formal account of Treaty 3. And so I just took one aspect of it. This is the closing speech by Chief Mawadopenes, and I'll just quickly read it. Now you see me stand before you all. What has been done here today has been done openly before the Great Spirit and before the nation. And I hope that I may never hear anyone say that this treaty has been done secretly. And now in closing this council, I take off my glove, and in giving you my hand, I deliver over my birthright and lands. And in taking your hand, I hold fast all the promises you have made, and I hope they will last as long as the sun goes round and the water flows, as you have said. So that's the official count of the Treaty 3 negotiations, and that's the closing speech by one of the main chiefs. This, on the right, the handwritten account is an account of the very same negotiations, but this is written in a diary by an assistant treaty commissioner, Simon James Dawson again. And this account of Treaty 3 was made by Dawson for his own information. It wasn't shared with the Crown, and it actually was just collected with his papers when he died, and it was part of Library and Archives Canada. So in his recording of the same speech, he says, "Here I stand before the face of the nation and the commissioners. I trust there will be no grumbling. The words I have said are the words of the nation, and have not been said in secret, but openly, so that all could hear. And I trust that those who are not present will not find fault with what we are about to do today. And I trust what we are about to do today is for the benefit of our nation, as well as for our white brothers, that nothing but friendship may reign between the nation and our white brothers. And now I take off my glove to give you my hand and sign the treaty. And now before you all, Indians and whites, let it never be said that this has been done in secret. It is done openly and in the light of day." So this speech is very well known. It's very famous. It's a very eloquent closing speech. But right away, I realized that there's a huge problem when I compare Simon James Dawson's account to the official account, which is typed. And you can see what I have highlighted. I take off my glove, and in giving you my hand, I deliver over my birthright and lands is absent in Simon James Dawson's account. And right away, I was like, well, even Simon James Dawson's account, it even had more details than the official account. And I'm like, well, why would that not be in Simon James Dawson's account? And why is it in the official account? And based on my other reading of archival documents, I was able to show that the Crown, in this case, Treaty Commissioner Alexander Morris, inserted this statement into the historical record because it emphasizes a surrender of lands. The "I deliver over my birthright and lands" was not said by the chief. It was inserted by the Treaty Commissioner in order to emphasize a land surrender. But as you can see in Simon James Dawson's account, what the chief really says is, "I take off my glove to give you my hand and sign the treaty." So that was the only evidence that I had that Canada was purposefully misleading the Indigenous leadership over the surrender of lands and over lands by inserting that phrase, "I deliver over my birthright and lands." So, and that's regarding Treaty 3. And so that was basically the closest I got to a smoking gun, I guess. But it really helped me in my thesis defense, in my dissertation defense, because when we were able to go around the table, of course, if you have an argument and if you cannot back up your argument, then you do not pass your dissertation. They basically said, "Oh, no, Sheldon, you have not provided enough evidence. You do not get your PhD." And so luckily, I was able to show that in actual fact, this was probably the case. And without this quote, I think I would have had a much more difficult time at the dissertation phase, and also the publication of the book. And I think that was my last slide. Yeah.
Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next month. If you're able to join us next month, we'll again have some special guests coming in. We will have Dr. Elizabeth Scott, who is our WDM curator, as well as Councillor Frank Royal from the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. They'll be speaking about a recent collaboration that has resulted in a new permanent exhibit at the WDM Saskatoon. Wapa Haska Oyede, Living Our Culture, Sharing Our Community at Pioneera, 1955 to 1969. And this will be on Tuesday, November the 15th at 10 a.m. if you're able to join us.